The Draconian Empire stood as a testament to the power of brute strength and military might, a colossal force in the galaxy that had crushed countless worlds under its heel. The Draconians, a formidable reptilian species, were known for their towering physiques, thick scales, and a primal ferocity that had been honed through millennia of conquest. Their empire, vast and unchallenged, had grown over centuries, expanding through the calculated use of fear and domination. Central to their culture was the belief that only the strong deserved to lead, and this belief was enforced through the ancient tradition of single-combat duels. These duels were not mere displays of physical prowess, they were a fundamental part of the Draconian way of life. Any species that sought to negotiate peace, trade, or alliance with the Draconians was required to first send their greatest warrior to face the Draconian king in combat. Victory in these duels was the only path to earning the respect of the Draconians and securing any form of treaty. But no species had ever succeeded. The Draconian king, the Empire's most feared and respected figure, had never been defeated in combat. His unmatched skills and brutal efficiency in the arena were legendary, and his reign had lasted for centuries without challenge. The king's reputation was more than just myth, it was a carefully cultivated tool of political dominance. Every duel he fought and won solidified the Draconian Empire's position in the galaxy, reminding all species that the Draconians were invincible. His victories were not just personal achievements but statements of the Empire's unassailable power. The defeated challengers, no matter how formidable in their own right, became symbols of the futility of opposing Draconian rule. This ritualistic combat was the foundation of the Empire's expansion, allowing them to subjugate other species without the need for prolonged wars. It was a system that had worked flawlessly for centuries, and the Draconian king had grown arrogant in his undefeated status. The king himself was a figure of both awe and terror. Towering over his subjects, his scales dark as obsidian, he was the embodiment of Draconian strength. His combat skills were unparalleled, honed over centuries of battles against the best warriors the galaxy had to offer. But it wasn't just his physical prowess that made him feared, it was his cold, calculating mind. He knew how to exploit the weaknesses of his opponents, how to break their spirits before crushing their bodies. His victories were as much psychological as they were physical, and this combination of intellect and strength made him seemingly invincible. When humanity first made its presence known on the galactic stage, the Draconian king's interest was piqued. Humans were a new species, one that had rapidly advanced from their home planet to explore the stars. They were not the first species to achieve space travel, but their speed and determination were unusual. Still, to the Draconians, humanity was just another upstart race, one that needed to be put in its place. As was tradition, when humans sought to establish diplomatic relations with the Draconian Empire, the king issued the customary challenge. He would face Earth's greatest warrior in single combat, confident that this duel would end like all the others, with his victory and humanity's submission. The king's confidence was rooted in centuries of unbroken triumphs. He saw humanity as yet another species that would be humbled before the might of the Draconians. There was no doubt in his mind that this would be an easy victory. The humans, with their smaller, weaker frames and lack of natural armor, seemed ill-equipped for the brutality of Draconian combat. The king looked forward to adding another victory to his legacy, another species to the growing list of those who had fallen before him. It was a ritual he had performed countless times, and the outcome had always been the same. But this time, things were different. Humanity's warrior was not just any soldier. He was a product of Earth's most advanced military science, a genetically enhanced supersoldier who had been through the most rigorous training programs known to humankind. The Draconian king, in his arrogance, did not anticipate that this human might pose a real challenge. He did not consider that humanity, though new to the galactic stage, had learned from the mistakes of others, had studied the Draconian combat style, and had prepared for this moment with meticulous care. As the day of the duel approached, the Draconian king remained as confident as ever, certain that he would emerge victorious. He did not know that the human warrior, calm and determined, was ready to face him with a strategy and skill set unlike anything the king had encountered before. The stage was set for a confrontation that would not only test the limits of both warriors but would also challenge the very foundations of the Draconian Empire's dominance. Humanity had entered the arena, and the Draconian King was about to face a battle that would change the course of galactic history. The human warrior selected for this monumental duel was no ordinary soldier. He was a product of Earth's most advanced military program, a genetically enhanced soldier bred and trained for scenarios just like this. Born from a lineage of warriors, his genetic code had been meticulously refined to amplify his strength, speed, and cognitive abilities. From a young age, he was groomed to become part of Earth's elite military unit, a group known for undertaking the most dangerous and critical missions across both terrestrial and extraterrestrial battlefields. His experience was vast, with countless combat scenarios under his belt, ranging from guerrilla warfare on Earth's most treacherous terrains to zero-gravity battles in the cold expanse of space. He had seen it all, faced enemies of every kind, and emerged victorious time and again. But it wasn't just his genetic enhancements that made him formidable. His training was relentless, pushing the limits of human endurance and beyond. He had been conditioned to thrive in the most extreme environments, to keep fighting even when others would have succumbed to fatigue or fear. His physical training was complemented by rigorous mental conditioning, teaching him to remain calm under pressure, to analyze his surroundings with a tactical mind, and to adapt quickly to any situation. Every muscle, every reflex, every thought had been honed to perfection. His body was a weapon, finely tuned and ready to strike with lethal precision. Technology played a significant role in his preparation as well. Equipped with the latest advancements in military tech, the warrior's armor was not only a shield but also an extension of his own body. It was designed to enhance his natural abilities, providing real-time data analysis, environmental scanning, and adaptive camouflage. His weaponry was state-of-the-art, capable of delivering devastating force with pinpoint accuracy. But more than that, his equipment was designed for versatility, allowing him to switch strategies on the fly, adapting to the ever-changing dynamics of combat. Every piece of gear had been tested in the harshest conditions, and every failure had been analyzed to create something stronger, more reliable, and more deadly. As the duel with the Draconian King approached, the warrior's focus sharpened. He knew this was not just another mission, this was the culmination of everything he had trained for. The Draconians were known for their brute strength and overwhelming physical power, but the human warrior understood that this duel would not be won by strength alone. He spent hours studying the Draconian fighting style, analyzing footage from previous duels, and identifying patterns and weaknesses. The Draconian King, for all his power, was predictable in his arrogance. He relied on his opponents being intimidated, on their inability to withstand his initial onslaught. But the human warrior was different. He wasn't just prepared to withstand the king's attacks, he was ready to counter them with speed, precision, and intelligence. Strategic planning became his obsession. He knew that in a direct confrontation, the Draconian King would likely overpower him, so he focused on agility, on outmaneuvering the king rather than meeting him head-on. He developed a strategy that played to his strengths, his superior speed, his ability to read the battlefield, and his capacity to think several steps ahead. The human warrior intended to turn the king's own strength against him, to exploit his overconfidence, and force him into making mistakes. Every move was calculated, every possible scenario anticipated. The warrior was ready to adapt, to shift tactics as needed, but always with the end goal in mind, victory. The gravity of the challenge weighed heavily on him, but it did not deter him. He understood what was at stake. Failure in this duel would not only mean his death but also the collapse of humanity's efforts to secure a place in the galactic community. The Draconian Empire was a powerful force, and if the king won, it would send a clear message to all other species. Humanity was not to be taken seriously, not worthy of respect or alliance. The future of Earth's relations with the rest of the galaxy hinged on this one moment. But the warrior did not let this pressure affect his resolve. He approached the duel with a calm determination, fully aware of the risks but confident in his abilities. He was not driven by fear of failure but by the certainty of his purpose. This was not just a fight for survival, it was a fight for the future of his people. As the day of the duel approached, the human warrior prepared in silence, his mind focused and clear. Every muscle, every reflex was ready. He knew the Draconian king would come at him with everything he had, but he was prepared to face it, to absorb the king's power and redirect it with devastating effect. He was not just stepping into an arena, he was stepping into history. This duel would not be just another chapter in the Draconian king's long list of victories. It would be a turning point, a moment that would redefine humanity's place in the galaxy. And the warrior was ready. The duel commenced with a tension that could be felt in every corner of the grand arena. This was no ordinary battleground. It was a place of tradition, steeped in the blood of countless challengers who had dared to face the Draconian king. The arena itself was a colossal structure, its walls adorned with the trophies of past victories, each a reminder of the king's invincibility. The audience, composed of Draconian elites, watched with confident anticipation, fully expecting their king to add yet another victory to his unbroken record. The air was thick with the certainty of the king's imminent triumph, and the spectators reveled in the spectacle about to unfold. As the two combatants took their positions, the size difference was stark. The Draconian king, towering and heavily muscled, radiated sheer power. His scales gleamed under the harsh lights, and his eyes burned with the intensity of a predator ready to strike. Across from him, the human warrior appeared smaller, less physically imposing, yet there was an undeniable aura of determination about him. The king eyed his opponent with a mixture of disdain and curiosity, eager to crush this upstart human who had dared to challenge him. The duel began with a thunderous roar from the king, who charged forward with terrifying speed for his size. His first attack was a powerful, sweeping strike intended to end the battle swiftly. The force behind it was immense, capable of shattering bones and armor alike. But the human warrior, anticipating the brute force of the attack, was already moving. With a calculated sidestep, he avoided the blow, his movements fluid and precise. The audience watched, surprised by the human's agility, but still confident in their king's eventual victory. The king continued his assault, each strike more ferocious than the last. He pressed forward, using his overwhelming strength to try and corner the human, forcing him into a position where a single blow would finish the fight. The arena shook with each of the king's attacks, the ground beneath their feet cracking under the pressure. Yet, despite the relentless barrage, the human warrior remained unscathed, deftly avoiding the worst of the king's onslaught with quick, decisive movements. He was not just dodging, he was observing, learning the king's patterns, waiting for the right moment to strike back. As the duel wore on, it became clear that the human was not merely defending himself, he was systematically dismantling the king's strategy. Each time the king attacked, the human was there with a counter, not just avoiding damage, but positioning himself in ways that made the king's strength work against him. The Draconian's attacks, while powerful, began to miss their mark more frequently, striking only empty air or glancing off the human's armor. The audience, once so confident, started to shift uneasily in their seats. They had never seen their king struggle like this, never witnessed an opponent who could so effectively neutralize his brute force. The king, sensing that his usual tactics were failing, grew visibly frustrated. He began to push harder, his movements more aggressive, his attacks more reckless. He roared with fury, his pride wounded by the human's defiance. But the human warrior, calm and composed, continued to execute his plan. He used the king's aggression against him, drawing him into traps, forcing him to overextend and leave himself vulnerable. The king's earlier confidence was now replaced with a growing realization that this duel was unlike any he had fought before. With each passing moment, the human's strategy became more apparent. He was not trying to outmuscle the king, he was outthinking him. The human's superior combat skills, honed through years of training and countless battles, were beginning to take their toll on the Draconian king. The king, for all his power, was finding it increasingly difficult to land a decisive blow. The human's speed and intelligence were proving to be a formidable combination, one that the king had not anticipated. The tension in the arena was palpable as the duel entered its next phase. The Draconian elites, who had started the fight with cheers and confident grins, were now watching in silence, their faces etched with concern. Their king was not dominating as they had expected. He was being matched, if not outmatched, by the human warrior. The king, now driven by frustration and anger, launched a series of increasingly desperate attacks, but each one was met with the same frustrating outcome, the human evading, countering, and never allowing the king to gain the upper hand. As the duel progressed, it became evident that the king was being forced into a defensive position, something he was unaccustomed to. The human's tactics were relentless, each move calculated to wear down the king's stamina, to exploit every opening with precision strikes. The human was not just fighting to survive, he was systematically breaking down the king's defenses, turning the duel into a battle of endurance and intellect. The Draconian king, who had never known defeat, was now facing the very real possibility that his reign of invincibility might be coming to an end. The once certain outcome of the duel was now anything but assured. The human warrior, through a combination of skill, strategy, and unyielding determination, was challenging everything the Draconian king had relied on for centuries. The king's strength was formidable, but it was no longer enough. The human had begun to turn the tide of the battle, and with each passing moment, it became clear that this duel was far from over. The Draconian king, now fully aware that his usual tactics were failing, began to feel a creeping sense of desperation. This was unfamiliar territory for him, a warrior who had never known defeat, who had always relied on his sheer physical power to crush any opponent. His frustration was palpable, and it showed in the way his attacks became more frenzied, less controlled. He abandoned any semblance of strategy, opting instead to rely purely on brute strength, believing that if he could just land a single, decisive blow, the fight would be over. But each attempt to overpower the human warrior was met with the same result: evasion, counterattack, and another missed opportunity. The human warrior, on the other hand, was executing his plan with precision. Every movement was calculated, every strike aimed with intent. He had spent the early part of the duel learning the king's patterns, understanding the rhythms of his attacks, and now, he was using that knowledge to turn the tide. Where the king's strikes had once seemed unstoppable, they were now clumsy and predictable in the eyes of the human. The warrior's speed allowed him to dart in and out of the king's reach, landing blows that, while not immediately devastating, began to wear the king down. Each strike from the human was deliberate, targeting key areas that would slow the king, sapping his energy and reducing his ability to fight back. The king, for the first time, found himself on the defensive, struggling to keep up with an opponent who was not just matching his strength but surpassing it with superior tactics. The human's attacks were not random. They were part of a larger strategy designed to exploit the king's overconfidence and rigidity in his fighting style. The king's earlier arrogance began to transform into something more dangerous: fear. He could sense that the battle was slipping out of his control, that the human was dictating the pace and terms of the fight. This realization shook him to his core. For centuries, he had been the epitome of invincibility, the standard against which all others were measured. Yet here he was, struggling to land a blow against a human, an opponent he had believed would be an easy conquest. Each failed attempt to regain control of the duel only deepened his desperation, making him more reckless and less effective. The human warrior, recognizing the king's growing vulnerability, pressed his advantage. He began to push the king harder, forcing him into positions where his options were limited. The king's movements, once powerful and fluid, were now labored and frantic. The human's attacks came faster, each one more precise than the last, targeting the weak points in the king's armor, exploiting the gaps in his defenses. The king, who had once dominated the arena, was now barely holding his ground. As the battle continued, the shift in power dynamics became undeniable. The Draconian king, once the undisputed ruler of the arena, was being systematically dismantled by the human warrior. The audience, composed of Draconian elites who had watched the duel with smug confidence, began to react with disbelief. Murmurs of concern rippled through the crowd as they saw their invincible king faltering. This was not the outcome they had anticipated, and the reality of what was unfolding before them was difficult to accept. The human was not just surviving, he was winning. The human's relentless assault began to take its toll on the king. His attacks, once so powerful and intimidating, now lacked the force they once had. Each movement became slower, more cumbersome, as the human warrior continued to land blow after blow. The king's defenses, which had seemed impenetrable at the start of the duel, were now crumbling. The once proud ruler of the Draconians was being driven back, step by step, by an opponent who had turned the battle into a display of superior strategy and combat skill. The audience's disbelief turned to shock as they watched their king struggle to keep up with the human's relentless onslaught. The invincibility that had defined the king's reign was shattered in a matter of moments. The Draconian elites, who had never doubted their king's ability to win, now faced the harsh reality that their leader was losing. The shift in the arena's atmosphere was palpable. What had started as a celebration of the king's expected victory had turned into a stunned silence as the human warrior asserted his dominance. The king, now desperate and fearful, made one last attempt to reclaim control of the duel. He launched a final, all-out assault, putting every ounce of his remaining strength into a flurry of attacks meant to overwhelm the human. But it was too late. The human, anticipating this desperate move, was ready. With a series of swift, precise strikes, he dismantled the king's offensive, countering with devastating accuracy. The king's final attack ended not with the human's defeat, but with his own. The tide had turned completely. The Draconian king, once the symbol of unassailable power, was now at the mercy of a human warrior who had outmaneuvered and outthought him at every turn. The audience, once so confident in their king's invincibility, now looked on in horror as the human warrior stood victorious, the king's arrogance and strength having been undone by a superior mind and unmatched skill. The duel, which had seemed so certain at the start, ended in a way that none of them had expected. The duel reached its climax in a moment that would be remembered throughout the galaxy. The Draconian king, now weakened and exhausted, made one last desperate attempt to regain control. He lunged at the human warrior with all the strength he could muster, a final, reckless bid to turn the tide. But the human, calm and focused, was ready. With a swift, calculated movement, he sidestepped the king's attack and delivered a decisive blow, one that struck with such precision and force that it left no doubt about the outcome. The king, staggered by the impact, faltered. The power and confidence that had defined him for centuries drained away in an instant. The realization that he had been defeated, not just in battle but in every way that mattered, hit him with crushing clarity. His once mighty form, which had towered over opponents and inspired fear across the galaxy, now seemed diminished. The human warrior stood over him, victorious, the embodiment of everything the king had underestimated. As the king fell, his thoughts raced. He had never considered that a human, a species he had deemed inferior, could defeat him. His entire reign had been built on the certainty of his invincibility, and now that certainty was shattered. The king's mind filled with regret, a deep and bitter understanding that he had misjudged humanity, and it had cost him everything. The arrogance that had once been his strength was now his downfall, and with it, the Draconian Empire's position of dominance was thrown into question. His defeat marked the end of an era, the closing of a chapter in the galaxy's history where the Draconians reigned supreme. The arena, once filled with the roar of the Draconian elites, fell into a stunned silence. The spectators, who had come to witness another victory for their king, were now faced with an unimaginable reality. Their invincible leader had been defeated by a human. The shock rippled through the crowd, disbelief giving way to fear and uncertainty. The Draconian Empire, which had never known anything but victory, was now confronted with the prospect of a future where their power was no longer absolute. The king's defeat sent shockwaves beyond the arena, reverberating throughout the empire and the wider galaxy. News of the king's downfall spread rapidly, reaching every corner of the galaxy. The once unbeatable Draconian king had been brought low by a human warrior, a fact that forced every species to reassess their understanding of humanity. The balance of power, once so firmly in the hands of the Draconians, was now in flux. Species that had once feared the Draconians began to look at humanity with a mixture of respect and apprehension. The human victory was not just a triumph in the arena, it was a declaration that humanity was a force to be reckoned with. The immediate reaction from the Draconian Empire was one of disbelief and denial. They had never considered the possibility of defeat, and now they were forced to confront the reality that their leader, their symbol of power, had been bested. The loss shook the foundations of the empire, sparking debates and power struggles among the elites. There was fear of what this defeat meant for their future, and uncertainty about how to proceed in a galaxy where their dominance was no longer assured. Across the galaxy, other species began to reevaluate their alliances and strategies. Humanity, once seen as a newcomer, was now recognized as a significant player on the galactic stage. The victory had proven that humans were not just capable of survival but could also challenge and defeat the most powerful forces in the galaxy. This shift in perception led to a new era of diplomacy, where species sought to align themselves with humanity, hoping to either share in their newfound strength or avoid becoming their next opponent. Humanity's rise was swift and profound. The victory in the duel had established them as a power to be respected, and perhaps even feared. The Draconian defeat became a turning point in galactic history, marking the beginning of a new era where humanity's influence began to grow. Other species, recognizing the potential of this emerging power, began to look to humans for leadership, advice, and protection. Alliances were formed, and the once overlooked humans found themselves at the center of galactic politics. The shift in power dynamics was undeniable. Where once the Draconians had ruled unchallenged, now humanity stood as a beacon of strength and determination. The galaxy, which had long been shaped by the might of the Draconian Empire, was now being reshaped by the presence of humans. The story of the duel, of how a single human warrior had defeated the Draconian king, became legend, told and retold across the stars, a symbol of the new era that had begun. As the dust settled and the galaxy began to adjust to this new reality, it was clear that humanity's place in the cosmos was firmly established. They were no longer seen as just another species. They were a force with the potential to change the course of galactic history. The respect they had earned was accompanied by a certain degree of fear of what humanity might become, of what they might achieve next. The galaxy watched, waiting to see how this new power would shape the future. The story ended not with the finality of the king's defeat, but with the promise of what was to come. Humanity had proven themselves in the arena, and now they stood on the threshold of a new era. An era where their decisions and actions would reverberate across the stars, where their influence would be felt by all. The galaxy was forever changed, and humanity's role in that change was just beginning.